Hi everyone, and welcome to my guide for what I believe to be the overall best rogue build in Diablo 4 when the game launches. The Death Trap Twisting Blades Rogue. I've written a guide on this on Maxwell already. You can go check out the full in-depth written version of this as well. So we have everything you need in here. But I also wanted to make the video guide for it for you guys to better explain a few things. This build is extremely fast. You can fly through the zones, as you can see here. This is my level 76 rogue, so this was not even like fully endgame optimized or anything like that. The build does need a little bit of time to come online because it is based around an ultimate ability. But you can also just play a regular Twisting Blades rogue if you have tried that, for example in the open beta. This is how I leveled up, and then later on I swapped it around. In fact, we do have a Twisting Blade leveling guide as well that goes through all the details from 1 to 50 leveling with this link here. So you don't have to death trap on this kind of like ultimate synergy in this build. And there is also a Twisting Blades version of this without the traps. But when I had the early access last week, I was experimenting a lot with those theory crafted rogue builds that I had prepared. And I think this is the best to just like blast away. So this is what I'm going to be using to race to level 100 on hardcore. I think it's a quite hardcore viable build. It can be quite fast. And we'll see exactly how it will hold up once I'm actually level 100 or so, because I didn't actually get all the way there, but it was going really smooth, it felt powerful, and really, really fun. So you have the Death Trap. You can see here this effect where it knocks everything together and it pulls them all in. And this is the time when you can do a massive nuke. You can CC the entire pull at once and be completely safe from most danger and just destroy and decimate. You can also see that the Death Trap cooldown actually resets extremely fast. This is a 50 seconds cooldown, and you can see here it comes back sometimes in like 2 seconds or something like that. The main way to accomplish this is the key passive exposure from the rogue that is actually extremely powerful. So you have a 25% lucky hit to reduce the cooldowns of your traps by 20%. So it kind of just like jumps back to being ready again in a matter of seconds, depending on how large the pull is. On a single target, this doesn't happen that much. But generally, the way to do this is that Twisting Blades, first of all, resets cooldowns as well with the advanced Twisting Blades upgrade. And on top of this, you get the exposure procs. And Twisting Blades has a rather high lucky hit chance. It has 33%. And you also have the Blade Dancer aspect that produces more hits. So these extra blades that you can see spinning around the character when I attack are actually hitting again and producing lucky hits as well. So that even on a single target, each Twisting Blade cast can do something like 3, 4, even 5 hits or so because of the swirling blades around you. And of course in an AoE, you get like 3, 4 chances or so of lucky hit per attack, and you just proc anything. And with this combination, we are able to reset both the Death Trap and the Poison Trap in no time, and we have near infinite resources because we can run Inner Sight, and you can just spam your Twisting Blades, your core skill all the time, because you constantly get these Inner Sight procs that give you full energy for 4 seconds. In fact, when you have a more optimized setup later, you can also do some adjustments and try to get the preparation in there. The Poison Trap in this build enables lots of different utility effects and passives and damage reduction bonuses, and it knocks down all enemies. So you see here, it has a 2 seconds knockdown when you activate it. So you can combo those two together. You can run into a pack, throw down the Death Trap, and then follow up with the Poison Trap, and everything will be crowd controlled because it just got pulled in, and you can just do whatever you want with the entire pull. So the Poison Trap doesn't really do all that much damage in the setup. This is mostly a crit based, like hit based setup, and dots can't crit and they don't really scale that well in the late game. In the early game, that is a bit different. So for example, for the Twisting Blades leveling guide, I do have the Poison Trap as well, and we don't have the Death Trap here because it comes online very late. And actually the Poison Trap does contribute there, but later on, not so much. So most of the damage is still coming from your Twisting Blades, and then the Death Trap that also produces actually quite significant damage numbers. In those clips that I'm showing here, you see that I'm not running Dark Shroud, so I just try to speed up my setup even further by going Dash plus Shadow Step. In my opinion, you can choose either one of those 2 agility skills, so you can, either jump in or just dash around wherever you want. Both works in my opinion. And sometimes you can even combine it. So when you feel like you don't really need any more defense, it's totally fine to go with both. But generally, I would recommend the setup that I have in this written guide here, which includes Dark Shroud. So Dark Shroud is just a really massive damage reduction and you can reset it with Twisting Blades. It helps a lot against boss fights, it gives you extra movement speed. It's just an overall really solid skill to have on the rogue, especially when you feel a bit squishy. In terms of legendary aspects, I have the core ones listed here. So the most important one is the Blade Dancer. You can unlock this one in Skosglen, in Jalal's Vigil, it's like in the northeast. And this one gives you this swirling Twisting Blades orbit. And even if you don't have a really good roll on this, if you just use the Codex power, then you get those extra lucky hits that I just described to reduce the cooldowns of your traps. So just having this anywhere is already good enough, but of course you want to have a good roll, and we also put it on the ranged weapon to give the 100% bonus, because this actually does pretty significant AoE damage. Other than that, we have the Blast Trapper. This is also a quite important effect because it gives you vulnerable uptime basically all the time when you fight large enemies, if you fight bosses, and you don't have to use, for example, Puncture to apply vulnerable all the time. So I put this on the amulet because it has a higher chance there, so that they have like a very smooth, high vulnerable uptime. I think maybe in the late game you could swap this to another slot when you have enough attack speed, enough lucky hit and all that, but in general I think the amulet is a good slot here. And then there is also Disobedience. Disobedience is probably the most powerful defensive aspect in the entire game. It gives you extra armor, and armor gives you most of your damage reduction. And in this case, you can easily cap out with the maximum 85% armor damage reduction. So against physical damage, you're going to be well protected because of this, because you get many hits, for example, from the Twisting Blades and from the Death Trap hitting stuff and from the Poison Trap hitting and the Poison Trap dots ticking. So this is the main combo to stack up this Obedience, and you have tons of armor that way. There are a bunch of other useful aspects that just give you extra damage or damage reduction. So you can also unlock, for example, the Protector for the barrier. You can unlock Might for damage reduction when you use a basic skill. Here's the Ghost Walker, which is very useful because when you have Shadow Step, you get unstoppable and then can walk through enemies. You can run right into the center, and you can throw down a Death Trap, throw down the Poison Trap, and then you have like the perfect synergy. There's also Edge Masters, which is also unlocked in the Codex, and Vengeful. So these are just like general offensive aspects. There is one more quite important aspect for the late game, which is the Manglers. Manglers allows you to kind of perpetuate crowd controls, because remember the combo with the traps and the vulnerable? Well, now you can make vulnerable enemies dazed. And dazed is effectively just like a stun, so it just completely disables enemies, and you can just daze them over and over and over. And on top of this, you can also knock them down, which triggers the concussive passive. So this is kind of the damage combo that we enable there. So the passive I'm talking about here is trick attacks. You see when you critically strike a dazed enemy, they are knocked down, and we only put 1 point in there to enable this knockdown synergy, and then get 50% extra crit chance of 3 seconds after knocking them down. And sometimes you can see this maybe in those clips. They just get knocked down over and over and over, because every time you hit them while they are dazed, and this daze lasts for 2 seconds, they just get knocked down over and over. So you have tons of crowd control, it's quite safe, and you get damage buffs. And all of this can be further amplified with the smiting aspect that you can also just find and not put on the codex. But it gives you a bunch of extra crit chance and crowd control duration, so that your poison trap suddenly knocks down enemies for like 2.5 seconds or so. And this daze lasts for almost 3 seconds that you produce from Mangler. And in that case, you can, just be completely protected from almost any attacks. I do have a full Paragon setup with progression steps also linked here, so you can go check them out in detail. And to give you a short overview here, so we start out, of course, on a starting board. We put a total of 5 different glyphs on this. So we have Exploit, which is like the #1 glyph in the game. There's Combat, which is like the #2 glyph for Rogue. So those give you lots of vulnerable damage and critical strike damage, both of which are pretty massive damage multipliers. We're trying to stack as close to like 100% crit as possible with this build, which also produces other synergies such as healing. Then we have Diminish that buffs the rare nodes. There is one particular rare node that we want to buff, which is on the Deadly Ambush board. So it's actually the second board here. If you go up these few steps, there is the damage reduction from enemies affected by trap skills. So generally it's kind of difficult to build defenses on a rogue, and this is a really good way of doing that. So you get 28% damage reduction from just this rare node. There's also 2% more, 2% more in here. So you can get something like a 30+% damage reduction from this combo with the glyph. So this is the main reason why I put this in a bunch of my rogue endgame builds. It's damage reduction and you really need it. And if you have the poison trap in a build, this is a good reason to use it. The other two glyphs are pretty straightforward. There's Turf, which is extra damage to close enemies and damage reduction. And then there's Closer, which is, again, basically just extra damage for your Twisting Blade. And again, damage reduction. So in general, I try to include as much defense as possible into the setup. Also, the Paragon setup has a bunch of damage reduction nodes. For example, we have Safeguard on the cheap shot board that gives you lots of damage reduction from elites. There's 13% and then another 3.3 2 times here from the magic nodes. And then there is yet even more damage reduction with the Brawler node that is on the Tricks of Trade board. This one gives you again 4.5% damage reduction and then 2.3 and 2.3 again. So this is even more defense that you pick up here. One thing to note here that if you're looking at this Paragon setup, you do have the endgame glyphs already in the right spot, so it's a bit difficult to predict like when I'm gonna find the glyphs and when I'm gonna level them. Of course, this is a bit up to you. I do have the order of priority in which you should level them here, so exploit first, then combat, etc. And then we have like the right spot to put them once they are fully leveled here. So maybe as you progress, you might not have all those glyphs available and you're gonna level some other one before that and so on. So always just try to put the glyphs into any of those sockets and try to maximize them as much as you can at that point. For example, the Closer glyph is a bit low on the priority. And if you have, for example, already found the exploit glyph, you can just throw it in this socket for now, and then you can unsocket it later and then put it in the right place once you are there and once you have taken all those strength nodes that buff the exploit glyph. So you can always just, move it around a little bit, unspec a few points whenever a glyph comes online. In general though, the Paragon board is mostly designed around those glyphs. So you can see here, like I did pick up Deadly Ambush, which is a relatively powerful legendary node, I think. Gives you lots of extra critical strike damage, and we're trying to achieve very high crit chance. There's also the cheap shot legendary node, so this is just a nice pickup because it's only a few points, so this is the main reason why I pick it. And then the rest is mostly just pathing to some rare nodes and glyph sockets here. So the glyphs, they really produce a lot of power later once they are leveled, once they're maxed out, and you have here 54 strength in radius. You see 129% vulnerable damage. This is a massive amount of vulnerable damage. Plus the effect is really powerful too. So this is why there's a lot of these glyphs. And these legendary nodes, they're not really all too useful sometimes. Let's talk about the item stats a little bit. So if you start out, you want to have items that look a bit like this. In general, you prioritize a lot of defensive stats, especially on your chest and on your pants. So this is an example of a good chest piece, or like in the end game with high item power, it's going to look like this. You can have a lot of damage reduction from these items. You can see here 25% from close enemies, 10% baseline, 21% from enemies that are poisoned. So this is basically 2 or 3 defensive legendary aspects here just in stats on such an endgame piece. So you can actually make a character relatively tanky with just those items. The same applies for the pants. Again, you want to have those defensive stats here. It's quite important, in my opinion, that you focus on these slots. Don't underestimate how much more tanky you can get from these. And don't roll something like, or don't try to use an item that has something like plus 10% physical damage or something like that on a chest piece. I think this is a full bait, and you should really prioritize those defensive stats, at least on those 2 slots. Then there's these offensive slots, of course. So we have rings, for example. They can give you crit and crit damage. So this is really powerful. There's vulnerable damage on those rings. And you can get other useful stats. There's resource generation, there's lucky hit chance, there's maximum life. So there are other useful stats. And again, you should try to avoid those kind of like additive damage category stats, like physical damage or whatever. Just try to get like those other crit multipliers in particular. Of course, we want to be mobile, so you want to stack some movement speed, especially the boots have a lot. As you can see here, up to 26%. You can even put it on the amulet. For weapons, you definitely want to stack more of those damage stats as well. They have a lot of offensive power, so there's vulnerable damage again. So you want to have a crossbow because bows give you distant damage, which doesn't really help on this build. It's a full melee build. You even knock everything towards you, so it doesn't do anything. So crossbow is the way, and you have vulnerable damage, and you can roll even more. And then there are stats like critical strike damage and all of the additive damage categories. So damage to close enemies is probably the best, but you can also do core skill damage. You can do damage to crowd controlled enemies, damage to dazed enemies. There's a bunch of these stats. And of course, main stat, dexterity, is a relatively good damage stat to have on the crossbow as well, in my opinion. And similar for those weapons, they have exactly the same stats, just a bit lower. The last two slots here are the helm, that can give you cooldown reduction and also defenses. So you see this here, if you have a helm that has a bunch of cooldown reduction, that's really helpful. And also the gloves, they have a lot of offensive power. You want the ranks to the twisting blades, and then you want a bunch of crit, you want attack speed. And then there's also stuff like lucky hit chance, there's also stuff like trap skill cooldown reduction, which is quite helpful. There is trap arm time reduction, so they trigger faster. There's a bunch of really good stuff on the gloves to get. And finally, for the sockets, we have emeralds in the weapons for the crit damage against vulnerable targets. Everything should be permanently vulnerable. We are critting a lot, so this is very good. We have topazes in the armor slots that gives you damage reduction while crowd controlled. Even though you have Shadow Step in this build, I think it's really nice to have this because it also works with soft crowd controls when you're slowed and chilled and immobilized. You can still attack and you are super protected in that case, but sometimes you get just stunned and knocked down and you don't have any way out, and this is the way to survive it. And finally, we have the skulls in the jewelry for the extra armor, which might not really be that needed because of the aspect of disobedience, but generally armor scales a lot better than all resists in late game, but you can also put diamonds there. Now, there are a lot more details to go into with this build, but I covered all of the basics that are enough to get you up and running. I'm going to be blasting this build on launch. This is my choice for racing to 100. I think this is the overall best rogue build for progressing through the endgame. Once you have this depth online, once you have exposure passive, it just feels so good. It's so much fun to pull enemies together, has great damage output, and a good bunch of defense because of those trap synergies. And that's it for the guide. I wish you good luck with the launch of Diablo 4. I'm going to be blasting, of course, I'm going to be racing, and I'm going to be playing exactly this build. So if you have any questions or so, of course, just stop by on the stream. I'm going to be there. I'm going to try to figure out all of the details for the very late game as well, how Nightmare Dungeon pushing will go and all that. But I think it's going to be a pretty great ride. Hope you enjoyed this one, and see you guys next time.